Hello and welcome to another edition of another book review. This week I'll be reviewing Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. I'll talk very briefly about the authors before going into an overview of what the book is about. Talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Thompson and Klein are both journalists. Klein is mostly associated with the New York Times. He has an Ezra Klein show podcast for them and has been writing in kind of I would say, the left political sphere for a long time. He got his start around the time of the ACA Obamacare and healthcare policy and has been writing for a while. Thompson has also been a writer for The Atlantic for a long time. He's actually a really good writer, and I've enjoyed reading his pieces. I probably read more of his stuff than Klein. They've come together. I believe this is the first time they've co-written something, and this book is their view of where the Democratic Party needs to go. And where it needs to go, in their opinion, is having an attitude towards abundance. So, quite frankly, in the beginning, they lay it out and say, we believe that we need to build more of the stuff that we need, and the government should have a key role in doing that. And oftentimes, there is a scarcity mentality, or there's a lack of emphasis put on implementation. And this leads to things like red tape being holding up projects that could be implemented, like in California with the high speed rail, and the kind of time that it's taken, the delays that it's taken for them to build that continue to grow each year, and nothing gets built, which they believe leads to this feeling that the government is not working correctly for people, and overall leads to a mistrust in the government, which they feel is counterproductive to giving people quality of life. And so they walk through different areas where they feel that this abundance mentality can be used. Areas like housing and healthcare and transportation are probably the three biggest. Energy is also a big thing. They put a point at the beginning of the book to put their cards on the table and say they really care very deeply about climate change, and so everything they do is really through a lens of climate change and how to achieve the battle against climate change as quickly as possible. And so for that reason, they basically say we're really not talking to anybody who is to the right of a centrist. We're really not talking to any moderates or conservatives, right-leaning moderates or conservatives. I think they would probably also have issues with people who are centrists or independents who also kind of question their view on climate change in some ways. I'm not saying that is me, but I'm saying in the book they basically make a point to say we're really speaking to our Democratic brethren and basically saying that we need more of these things and this should be more of our attitude because, we have failed in many ways to live up to the post-war World War II period, and we're seeing a lot of the scarcity mentality take hold, what they believe is more of a conservative mentality, and that is really not enabling people to live what they would say is their best lives. And so that's it. I mean, it's a very, very short book. It's very much an airplane book, which is a book that gets sold in airports that people read. And it's very, very high level. There's not a lot of counter arguments that they consider. There's a whole section in the book about degrowth, which is probably the section I would be most interested to hear someone else counter. And I haven't read any reviews of this deeply. I know that Nate Silver has a review of the book. I know Matt Brunig has reviewed the book as well, and I haven't gotten a chance to read those, so I'm looking forward to that. But what I liked about the book is there's sometimes you need things that basically put flags down and basically say, this is what we believe. What do you believe? And so I think this book will be useful for that. And people will be able to refer to it and say, I believe this is true. I don't believe this is true. I agree with this. I don't agree with this. They also, at the beginning of the book, have a section where they use fiction, and they have a utopian version of what the world would look like if some of these policies were to come through, if for some reason we were able to achieve energy abundance of clean energy, and what the world would look like. And I thought that was really interesting. I think that that's a useful tool that I wish more nonfiction authors would use. The gold standard to me is still probably David Brooks doing that in The Social Animal. I thought that was really effective there. Tom Friedman did this in Hot, Flat, and Crowded as well. So I wish more authors did that. So they do that in this book. I think that they do. use a good job of statistics to make their points pretty quickly. There are times where I push back on a lot of the assertions they make, and there are a lot of assumptions that they make in the book that you have to either, if you don't agree with it, really have to step away and say, um, I'm just going to agree to disagree with this point because I don't. It's you've accepted this assertion to be true, and I think that it's really questionable. So, I like the fact that there are statistics that are pretty powerful. I like the way that they handle um, climate change as a focus. I think is useful as well. Um, there are a lot of things that I thought in this book. There's a philosophy podcast that I listen to that I think is a dead podcast now. I don't think they're making any more episodes. But they were reading Michael Sandel's Tyranny of Merit, and they were reviewing that book, and they were comparing that book to an Elizabeth Warren book that she had written. I don't know if it was a memoir or what it was, but they compared to what she had written, and they said time and time again in Elizabeth Warren's book, the person who Elizabeth Warren is most concerned about is the preternaturally gifted person who is not able to achieve the limit of their talents because of some kind of obstacle, some kind of barrier in society. The opportunity isn't there, or they're discriminated against, or whatever it is. And that person is kind of top of mind for Elizabeth Warren. Michael Sandel, that person is not top of mind for. This book was interesting because I think the fiction example that I mentioned before kind of gives you the person that Klein and Thompson are concerned about. And I think the fiction example, I like that they had it. I think it could have been better. It feels very much like you're an upper middle class dad in a wealthy city who's concerned about their children eating fruits and vegetables and vacationing. And so there are some people who are going to read that, I think, and be turned off by it right away. And the book is really not concerned about the culture wars. The book is really not concerned about, Klein and Thompson, how are we going to pay for any of these things? The book is really not concerned about, social issues within a Democratic Party or divisions between unions and gender relations and racial relations. And the book is just not concerned about any of that. And so I think a lot of people would look at what they are worried about, things like, they bring it up in this book. David Leonhardt brought it up in his book, that the amount of time it takes to travel from New York to London being greater than it was. I don't know if this is just a really salient example for them, or they really think people care very deeply about the amount of time it takes to travel. But that's what they care. That's what they care about. And so I think if you don't care about those things, or you think that those things are not that important, then you may take issues with it. For me, they're very pro-city. They kind of lay that out. And so a lot of their assumptions kind of stem from the idea of being pro-city. They have this section about remote work where they point to Elon Musk and Jamie Dimon and a bunch of other people who are very pro-work return to office. And they basically buy this assertion that remote work is less productive and less innovative than return to office. And they don't interrogate that at all. They don't ask the question, like, is that true? We did run what was essentially a natural experiment for a year with COVID, and even given the fact that people were under all kinds of psychological stress, productivity didn't really crater. And if you were expecting working from home to be drastically worse than working in an office, that's what you would expect to see, and it didn't happen. Now, maybe you could make the argument that there is some marginal trade-off for people who are in really highly creative industries where they have to work collaboratively. But that's very, very few in between jobs. Like if you're a software engineer or you're you make video games or you make movies or you do something where you're really highly interactive and you want people in the same room coming together with stuff, then maybe that would be the case. But for the vast majority of people, I imagine there's not really a lot of downside. And what irked me about it was, even if I see the argument that innovation is somehow harmed from working from home, which I would not normally cede, but if I have to cede that for this argument and say, marginally the innovation rate may be lowered by people working from home, the trade-off is you have a lot fewer people driving and commuting to the office. And if you're really concerned about climate change and you're really concerned about what is really the low-hanging fruit, then you should be very pro working from home because it allows people to not have those morning commutes and evening commutes, and it eases congestion. It does all those things. And I think the reason that they can't say that is because they have this idea that degrowth, anything that is a scarcity mindset, anything that is not allowing people to, um, anything that's taking away from people, uh, they don't like. Anything that may harm cities, they don't like. And so you have to ask the question, like, if what you're saying is true, if working from home is really um, this thing that would save like millions and millions and millions of miles driven, what is the trade-off there? What is the value of allowing people to force people to go to return to office? And I think they would say, well, in a perfect world, you'd have a public transportation system. And that's another thing about this book they get really passionate about is the high-speed rail. And you may be asking yourself a real basic question, like, do we need high-speed rail in the United States? Is this like something that like absolutely necessary? And there may be areas of the United States where it's useful. I imagine that if you made an argument, if you had a high-speed rail between New York and New Jersey, then you would increase productivity by quite a bit. I would question, would allowing a 100% remote work do most of that without spending billions and billions of dollars? I think it probably would. I think it probably would. If you're a financier and you have to commute 2 hours and you work 70 hours a week, having an extra 2 hours of sleep would probably make you a more productive person, and not forcing you to commute at all. Instead, I think Klein and Thompson basically say, well, we're going to believe what the owners of these companies say without questioning it, even though they're incentivized to lay off people and avoid the PR cost of actually laying them off. So this is something of a shield, but we won't go into that. They're not really too concerned about interrogating that story, but they would say, well, if we have high-speed rail, everybody can live in cities. And that, again, kind of assumes that everybody wants to live in the city. And during COVID, people left the city, and housing prices fell in places like New York and San Francisco, and it wasn't offset. There weren't people moving back into the city to offset those losses. So you still have in some places like New York, I think it's like a 5% drop. And if what they were saying is true, is that naturally people just wanted to move into the cities and they couldn't because of housing costs, well, that would prove to be an experiment as well that kind of proves that point wrong. I think there's a natural preference for a lot of people to not live in the cities. And they kind of poo-poo that away as if everybody wants to live in New York City, if only, they had the opportunity to. And this kind of is a problem with the book, that the book's not really interested in kind of interrogating either. So they're very pro-city. They don't really imagine that there are people who would work from home. They use this kind of cherry-picked example of Bentonville, Arkansas, where instead of having people come from wherever they're going to come from and work in Bentonville, which is the headquarters of Walmart decided to have like a Silicon Valley headquarters. And you're like, well, this assumes, of course, that Walmart made the correct decision, which, again, doesn't go challenged. But then also raises the question, is it possible that Walmart did that because they wanted to pay market rates in Silicon Valley as opposed to paying people like $300,000 to move to Bentonville? And if they did pay $300,000 to move to Bentonville, are you trying to tell me that they would not have gotten quality talent to come down there? That's a pretty hard argument, in my opinion, to make. And so they put a lot of weight on what are called agglomeration effects, which is basically the Medici effect, where you have a bunch of artists in the same place. Late 70s New York is another example. Silicon Valley is another example. They put a lot of emphasis on this thing, and it's not quite clear to me that the answers that they think are there are really truly there. They do a lot of relying on a couple of statistics to basically say, you see, we need to have people all living in cities because if we don't, the productivity is going to drop. And then that's another thing about the book. They talk a lot about productivity dropping and why it may be dropping, and they kind of poo-poo the low-hanging fruit idea, which is an idea that a lot of people have put forward. Tyler Cohen, I believe, has also put this forward. The book that I reviewed earlier, Sick Money, I'll leave a link below. They put that idea forward. And the thing about that idea is that basically it travels across the globe very well. You can say, well, the ideas have mostly been picked. And so that's true in Germany, or that's true in Italy, that's true in the United States, that's true in Latin America, or wherever that would still be true. And they say, no. If you look at NIH, the reason that innovation is slowing is because we're not trying big enough and bold enough ideas. And you go, well, you've used the NIH as an example, but why isn't that also true in anywhere else that's not the NIH? and they also don't really want to recognize with that either, or kind of see the tension there. So there are a lot of parts in the book where you kind of can feel them like picking an example and kind of Malcolm Gladwelling it and saying, well, this example is true, so all this must be true. And I found that to be kind of a difficult pill to swallow. So what's cool about this book is that like everybody's going to find something they don't like about it, and I don't know how many people are going to be like, "You're right, we need to build more stuff." Like it seems clear to me that like, and that's the one area where you would think that they would have the most consensus is the housing, because I think most people recognize that we're either in a housing shortage, either there needs to be more homes built, or zoning restrictions need to change to where housing becomes um, easier to you for you to build on auxiliary units and all this stuff. But even then, they recognize, and I reviewed "Understanding the Housing Crisis," I believe is the book by Chuck Marone. Um, I may have butchered that. I'll leave the link to that video below as well if you want to check that out. But they recognize, and Jerusalem Dempsis is a journalist that they quote too. You know, you can't have both things. If you're a homeowner, you can't have scarcity and an abundance of housing at the same time. Like those two things are in conflict. Like the price of your house in some ways relies on scarcity. And the more difficult thing to do would be for you to build up the community around you, or build up the value of your house by adding value and like remodeling a kitchen or adding a swimming pool or something. Those are hard things to do that a lot of people don't do. And it's a lot easier to just deny everybody else around you to build more housing to make your unit less unique, less special. Um, and they don't get into that tension. They just kind of poo poo it away as if like they go, oh man, how traffic is like this. They kind of poo poo it in a way that like dismisses people's like real concerns about lowering the value of their house, which they've pumped all their money into. And that was also something to me, like a cleaner answer to that question would have been, yeah, you need to have a moral reckoning with people to basically say, hey, look, you know, you've had the advantage of living in this house, and your house may not aggregate as much wealth as you would like, but the benefits of that is you live in a more fair and just society, and you have to have that trade-off. They also don't make a distinction between like building homes for housing people who are homeless, and housing people who want to come into Silicon Valley and work. And those are two solutions to me that are in conflict with each other, and you're going to have different strategies for both of them, and they're not really that concerned about that stuff. So a lot of the book is about what they view as things that have gone wrong. Some of that is the housing restrictions and zoning restrictions. Some of that is things like the high-speed rail example. Some of that is like Raiders, and how laws that were built in the 70s have now been used to slow down a lot of this development. And they have a whole section on degrowth, which was the section that I found the most interesting. And the obvious answer to me is, well, yes, you probably need to do both of these things. You probably need to find a way to, if there's something in the society that is really extremely wasteful, that is not adding very much utility, maybe it is a way for us to question why we're building all these things or buying all these things that are plastic that are kind of ending up at landfills that could be used for other stuff. I think they're right to recognize the chances, the low chances of Americans just giving up meat, or really most people giving up meat, and they recognize that, and they have a whole section on how if you had clean energy, it would make meat production easier. I don't know again, or lab grown meat easier, and that's also something where I'm like, I don't know if that's the bottleneck for people eating lab grown meat. I imagine it's closer to the taste and the texture than anything else, but you know, there are people who are smarter about that than I am. And so that was interesting to me, is like, well, the vision of utopia for these guys and the vision of utopia for the average person, I don't know how much overlap there is. I think if you're a Democrat, there's probably a little bit more overlap, because you probably care more about high-speed rail, and they really seem to be super, super concentrated on high-speed rail. I think there are parts in the book where they talk about renewable energy, and they frame it in such a way to where the benefits of it are, at one point they say, well, also energy bills would go down. And it's like these kind of like, part of that is like selling renewable energy to people is difficult in general, because part of it is really a maintenance issue. You're not really gaining anything by doing this thing. And so that's another problem. I realize my review probably has been kind of all over the board, because the book is kind of all over the board. Um, I'd be very, very interested if anybody has read it to kind of get takeaways from it. Those were kind of my takeaways and areas where I could see people being frustrated. The book does not really interrogate the business community at all, and it doesn't really interrogate the idea that AI is not a going to be a boon for people. And I think that there are arguments on both sides. There are people who are very, very skeptical of AI making people's lives better. There are people who are very, very skeptical of introducing this technology that we probably don't have a strong ability to control and how to put in controls and all this stuff. And they don't really consider that at all. They kind of are like, well, we need to keep building because we need the AI technology here because it's going to make the lives of Americans better and it's going to improve all these things. And I don't know. There's a wide range of opinions on AI and how much it's going to help or hurt the average person. And they have kind of picked a side on that. And I felt that that could have used also a little bit more interrogation. So in general, I would love to see kind of people debate a lot of the ideas that they have because they could be kind of attacked on a bunch of different levels, which is makes for an interesting book and is probably a really good book club book. So if you're someone who has a bunch of friends who are left of the dial, if you haven't already, pick this up and kind of kicked it around after you've read it. I think it's really good for that because people are going to either roll their eyes, point to it like this is something new or exciting and different. Um, it's not, in my opinion, the book is kind of missing some things, and one of them is like, what is the limits of where do you draw the line between what the government should be doing and what the private sector should be doing? And that is not clearly as clearly drawn as I would like. What is the appropriate amount of money that should be going into R&D by the government? And that, there's not really talk about money or budgets or any of that stuff. And they talk about kind of a bottleneck detective, which I think is an interesting idea. And you could have a process improvement person come in and really clean up a lot of these things. And he makes a strong argument that a lot of times the government's not really interested in reducing and improving kind of processes. And that is something they could probably focus a little bit more on to streamline things and make it more effective. And there's not really someone who's interested in doing that. They did through PSLF bring a bunch of people who were college educated into the federal government, and you would think that some of those people may be process improvement people, and some of that money that was incentivized by paying off their student loans would be going towards that, but it's not. That's a different story for another day. But that's abundance. What's cool about it is I think most people can read it and get something out of it. Um, if you're Californian, there's a lot of examples that are about California. Um, some of the logic doesn't, I think, always hold up. One of the things he talks about is, the amount of red tape and that being one of the impediments towards getting us to this energy abundance. And I would just point out, like, they point it sometimes to Texas and Georgia being states with relatively low regulation. And then you look at, like, the state of Texas for wind. And I used to work in the wind industry a few years ago, like 10 years ago. But, like, Texas at that point, I think, was 20% wind. Their energy comes from wind. Their total renewable energy is about 33%. And now they're at like 25% of wind. So they went up by 5% in 10 years. And so it can't simply be regulations. Some of this may be there's not enough money coming in. Businesses don't think they can make enough money, or they don't have the people to do these things at scale, like connect the grid, which to me, again, is not really a government problem. Like the question is like, if it's a company that's making money off these things, shouldn't the company be able to figure out how to train people and get it moving to where they're making the money? And that's a bottleneck that I don't know if that's a government problem or if it's a private sector problem. There's a lot of things like that. I could cherry pick the book all day, and I may end up doing like a podcast on me cherry picking the annoyances with the book. But I think it's a really cool book to kick around and debate. And if that's something you're interested in, you're going to get something out of it. Um, Next time, I will be reading Empire Falls, novel by Richard Russo. If you've read Abundance, please let me know below if you felt completely different, if it changed your mind. Um, just real quick, that the utopian fiction, there are a lot of writers who have written utopian fiction before. Solar punk is like a genre. Kim Stanley Robinson, Becky Chambers have both written really, really, really good pieces. The problem with Klein and Thompson is they're not fiction writers. And so this utopian just feels this like 2 pages of this like utopian vision just feels really flat and bland to me. There's no like succulence to it. There's no like emotional resonance with it. And so I don't know how many people it's going to move towards their position. So that was also a problem I had with the book. I'll leave it there. I'll leave the links below. Thank you for watching. If you haven't gotten a chance to subscribe to the channel, if you've enjoyed this, please do. Like the video if you get a chance. And until next time, bye.